This video is brought to you by World of Tanks. Join us in this free-to-play MMO strategy game, in which every passionate player will enjoy an enormous selection of 20th century armored steel beasts. With over 600 tank destroyers, artillery, light, medium, and heavy tanks, you get to rush in guns blazing, ambushing your opponents with sneaky tactics, or hanging back and taking them out from afar. The strategic options are endless. World of Tanks is where history meets action by offering historically inspired and accurate vehicles that are modeled to closely resemble their counterparts in real-life battle situations. Create yourself a steel beast ready for any challenge. A simple upgrade of your vehicle can help you soar across open fields, ascend steep hills, sneak through forests, and tear across deserts. Round up your teammates, devise a battle plan, and obliterate the competition in over 40 battle arenas. New players who register for the first time on the Wargaming portal can use the code TANKMANIA, which contains a Tier 5 Excelsior tank, 250,000 credits, 7 days premium access, 3 Tier 6 rental tanks for 10 battles each, a Tiger 131, the Cromwell B, and the T34 85M. Seize this unique opportunity. Download World of Tanks and prove yourself. T-34 Tank, a World War II armored legend. 1937 to 1943. A pack crew spots an approaching Soviet tank. The experienced gunners know exactly what to do once they've located the enemy tank. They work out the range and align their sights onto the tank, and then load a 37mm shell into the gun's breech. The commander gives the signal, and the gunner opens fire. The shell flies out of the barrel and hits the moving tank. When the smoke clears, they can see that nothing has happened, and the Soviet tank is still advancing towards them. The pack crew can't understand why the tank hasn't been destroyed, so they load and fire another round, but once again it just bounces off the enemy tank. The crew are beginning to get concerned and look at each other in bewilderment. Another round is fired, and then another. But the tank continues to move forward and is now getting very close to them. The pack crew starts to panic and abandon their gun as they run away in terror to escape being crushed beneath the tank's tracks. A green steel monster grinds itself over the pack anti-tank gun, crushing it beneath its tracks, and moves on, unimpeded and simply unstoppable. It was June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was in full swing, yet the Wehrmacht was facing an unknown enemy tank, one completely different from all the others. It was the T-34, a new generation of Soviet medium tank, one that would face a difficult start, but would carry on to become an absolute legend among tanks. In the summer of 1936, civil war broke out in Spain between the Republicans and the Nationalists. The Soviet Union was supporting the Republicans against the Nationalists, who were receiving support from Italy and Nazi Germany. In October 1936, a contingent of some 50 Soviet tanks arrived in Spain. The first tank battle took place on October 29th between the Soviet-made T-26 tanks and the Italian CV-35 tankettes. The Soviet tanks had a clear advantage with their armor, main guns, and mobility. Their 45mm 20K gun was designed as an anti-tank gun, modified for tank use, facing the 8mm machine guns of the Italian CV-35 tankettes. The outcome was to be expected. The T-26 dominated the battlefield. Even the reinforcements that Nazi Germany sent in the form of Panzer I tanks were not sufficient enough to oppose these new tanks. The Soviet tanks clearly had the advantage in terms of firepower and were able to knock out every tank that the enemy put into the field against them. The first reports sent back to the USSR by the Soviet military personnel and advisors were overall positive. Even with the inexperienced crews and lack of infantry support and coordination, the Soviet tanks managed to turn the tide and help defend Madrid. However, things started to turn bad for the T-26 and later on the BT-5 tanks. The prime weapons that they were facing were no longer the enemy tanks, but anti-tank guns. Nazi Germany was utilizing their most up-to-date anti-tank gun, the 37mm PaK-36. Reports sent back were becoming more and more alarming. Huge losses were taken, where even a couple of packs were now enough to stop an entire tank platoon. Something had to be done to rectify the problem. In the 1930s, the Red Army had a massive fleet of tanks, consisting mainly of T-26 and BT series. These tanks were inadequate in terms of armor, reliability, engine power, and parts maintenance. The Winter War and Battle of Khasan Lake, and later Khalkhin Gol, demonstrated all the weaknesses of the Soviet tank fleet: the thin armor, bad maneuverability, gasoline engines that were prone to catch fire when hit, and inadequate firepower. It can be difficult to keep up with new technology and ideas, and to just rely on and try and improve the old designs. One of these was a convertible drive. The concept was fairly simple. The tanks would use wheels like a regular motor vehicle when traveling on the road. The crew would mount the tracks when approaching the battlefield to gain better cross-country deployment. After the battle was over, the tracks could be removed, and the tank would become a wheeled vehicle again. In 1937 to 1938, the Kharkov factory number 183 was designing a new tank, designated the A20. Engineers used a typical approach by taking a well-proven tank as a base and improving it. The tank they used was the BT-7. They redesigned the turret, the armor plate, profiles and angles, widened the tracks and redesigned the road wheels. Thus, the tank they created had less in common with the BT series and became a foundation for the new line of tanks. By angling the armor plates, the designers achieved far superior protection. The sloped armor concept was not new, but had barely been used up to that point. The chief engineer, Mikhail Koshkin, was not totally satisfied with the results and of the whole concept of a convertible drive. On his initiative, another project went into the design stage, the A32. The main differences with the A20 was the removal of the whole mechanism for the convertible drive, increasing the armor protection to 30 millimeters and thus increasing the overall size. This in turn required another road wheel on each side, but allowed for the installation of a much stronger and larger cannon. Instead of the 45mm, the A32 would hold a 76.2mm L11 gun. The future of the T-34 was taking shape. The gamble paid off. During the state trials at Kubinka, the A32 outperformed the A20 project, partially due to the change and shift in thinking by the state leaders and decision-makers. They would shift from the convertible drive idea to the increased armor protection and firepower. As it turns out, state trials would take place in September 1939, the same month as the Wehrmacht would cross the Polish border and initiate World War II. This fact would also accelerate work on the tanks and the need to have them as soon as possible. The A32 tank was officially designated the T32. Even though the tank had passed state trials, the State Commission had requested some changes to be implemented in December 1939. Namely, to strengthen the armor to 45mm, to implement the cheaper and simpler F-32 cannon, increase the number of machine guns, make visibility better and strengthen the tank parts. Upon planned implementation of improvements, the tank was to be renamed the T-34. In January 1940, a new A-34 tank was ready for trials. The second model was assembled in the next month. Tests were vigorous and extreme. Many defects, problems, and general shortcomings were detected. Things like poor visibility due to glass fogging, bad ammunition racks, and the short lifespan of the V2 engine were sufficient enough reasons to delay production of the tank. Without waiting to correct all noted shortcomings, a tank race was organized in strict secrecy. A 750-kilometer drive from Kharkov to Moscow took place with the aforementioned designer Koshkin driving one of the tanks. Unfortunately, the chief designer Mikhail Koshkin would pay with his life with the development of the tank, succumbing to a bout of pneumonia he received during the state trials. He drove the T-34 tank for hundreds of kilometers while feeling unwell from Kharkov to Moscow. He was to be replaced by Aleksandar Morozov. The race would end at Ivanovskaya Square in the middle of the night in the confines of the Kremlin walls. The next morning, the State Commission, including Stalin himself, made a final decision. The tank had performed very well and left a great impression. On March 31, 1940, the Defense Committee issued instructions calling for the mass production of the T-34 at the Kharkov factory. The legend was born, and the journey of refining and battle-proving the tank had begun. On June 22, 1941, Germany unleashed Operation Barbarossa. It was, to that day, the largest invasion force in history, fielding some 3.5 million men, 3,400 tanks, and 2,700 aircraft. 3 army groups were heading towards Leningrad, Smolensk, and the Ukraine, aiming to cripple the Soviet defenses and decimate the Red Army. The Red Army was unprepared for the attack. Nominally, it had some 23,000 tanks, an astonishing figure. However, most of these were old T-26 and BT series. The first engagements were terribly one-sided. German panzers were inflicting high casualties due to the better equipment, better organization of armored units, and more experienced crews. The Soviet troops lacked support, logistics, maintenance facilities, and most of their tanks were needing some kind of repair, either light or a complete overhaul. However, on June 23rd, the Wehrmacht would face down an unknown new threat. In shock and terror, their anti-tank crews and even panzer crews would face the T-34 tanks. They would fire their most powerful shells and score direct hits, but nothing would have an effect on the enemy tanks. Even at point-blank range, penetration was not guaranteed. The Red Army faced many problems. The lack of spare parts, fuel, and shells meant that many tanks did not even have armor-piercing rounds. They would pack what they had at the moment, high-explosive rounds and any fuel they could get their hands on, and ride into battle. Some would simply roll over German anti-tank guns. One gun was able to confront the T-34s, though, the potent flak 88mm anti-aircraft gun. It had sufficient penetration and power to knock out any of these Red Army tanks. Luckily for the Germans, the Soviet tactics were poor in those days. Poorly planned and coordinated attacks, no coordination of adjacent units, sending armor and vehicles piecemeal instead of as a formation, lack of training of the crews, and the Luftwaffe had total air superiority. Many T-34s were lost to the Stuka air attacks. They were circling the battlefields almost unopposed as the Soviet Air Force had been decimated. In just one day, it had lost between 1,200 and 2,000 aircraft, most of which were densely packed on airstrips and carpet-bombed or strafed by the Luftwaffe. The Soviet Air Force had lost many new aircraft like the Yak-1, MiG-3, and Lag-3s. Those losses will have terrible consequences for the Red Army in the following months. Thus, of some 1,000 T-34s that were available at the start of Operation Barbarossa, just a few had survived. Many were left out, damaged, abandoned, or surrendered on the battlefield. Crews couldn't fix the simplest of mechanical breakdowns. Some crews had only a few hours of experience driving the tanks. Some had only just seen a tank for the first time when the war had started. Even if some of them could have fixed those mechanical problems, there were no spare parts nor logistics available to them. The Luftwaffe had bombed and knocked out most of the warehouses and facilities in the western districts of the Soviet Union. To make matters worse, the entire Soviet production was focused on producing tanks, not the spare parts. Due to the quarrels and obstructions in the bureaucracy chain, not all the T-34s were issued with the newer F-34 gun. Some had to go with the older L-11 gun. The hot and dusty summer months were replaced by the autumn rains. German tankmen soon found out what the Russian word Rasputitsa meant, a total lack of decent roads and a whole ocean of mud. Tanks got stuck, losing tracks, and trucks and light vehicles were unable to move or keep up, making a total mayhem of the logistics. On the other hand, the T-34s fared far better. Their wide tracks were better suited for such conditions, making lower ground pressure and a powerful diesel engine provided enough cross-country mobility. However, the Soviet tank production was facing difficult times. Many factories were disassembled and sent to the east, to the Urals and Siberia. Those that were still working were trying their best to assemble as many tanks as possible and send them to the front. Until the end of the year, some 2,000 T-34s were produced. It was not nearly enough to reinforce the ranks, especially after the heavy losses around Kiev, Vyazma, and other pockets and encirclements. Operation Typhoon was launched by the Germans in October 1941. Their main goal was the destruction of the Soviet forces defending Moscow and the capture of the city itself. Panzer groups were spearheading the advance, breaking through battered and scattered Soviet troops. Colonel Mikhail Kotukov and his 4th Tank Brigade took positions near Tula, some 170 kilometers from Moscow. The brigade was newly formed, with some 22 T-34 tanks among various other types. Around Mtsensk, the German 2nd Panzer Army was advancing, but was in for a nasty surprise. Soviet infantry had lured the German tanks into the open. Suddenly, Soviet tanks appeared on the flanks from out of the forest, striking a heavy blow. Soviet tank ace Lubushkin destroyed 5 German tanks in this single battle. Another tank ace, Dmitry Lavrenenko, also scored a high kill count. The German command was surprised and shocked. A commander of the 2nd Panzer Army, General Heinz Guderian, was furious that the advance on Tula had halted and momentum was lost. His assessment of the situation was looking bleak. The Soviet tanks were showing their superiority in a very sharp form. Tactics of employment were always evolving and changing. A special commission was sent by the Germans in November 1941 to assess the Soviet medium and heavy tanks. The outcome of this was that they had to step up the development and introduction of the Panzer V Panther tank. Colonel Kotukov paved the way for the new tank tactics. The T-34 tanks were dug in and heavily camouflaged. Dummy and fake positions were made. Tank crews were instructed to open fire only when a definite hit was guaranteed, at around a distance of some 200 to 300 meters. The T-34s were able to knock out enemy tanks from over 1,000 meters, while the German tanks had to come in much closer to guarantee a hit. Thus, in 1941, the T-34 could dominate the battlefield. The T-34 would play a significant role in the subsequent Soviet counteroffensive near Moscow in December 1941. It became a common sight to see T-34s with their wide tracks, painted white and with a squad of soldiers riding on top of them, charging across at the German lines. The trend continued in 1942, but some dangerous adversaries started to appear in the German army. To counter the T-34 threat, a new German heavy tank was introduced, the Panzer VI Tiger. With its 88mm main gun and 100mm of frontal armor, it proved to be a worthy opponent. The T-34 had to use its advantage of speed and maneuverability to outsmart the Tiger tank. Other vehicles like the Panzer IV Ausf F2, Stug 3 Ausf F, Martyr series, and the Pak-40 anti-tank cannon were a direct response to the threat of the Soviet tank. Compared to the old 50mm and short 75mm guns, these vehicles were all sporting longer-barreled 75mm cannons, making duels with T-34s more even. Soviet designers were trying to rectify the situation by improving the T-34 tank. The main demand of the Soviet High Command was for greater production numbers. Any change must not reflect heavily upon production figures. Thus, changes had to be implemented gradually and carefully. A Model 1942 had a number of technical improvements, some of which were designed to simplify the production process and cost. Namely, instead of welding, a cast turret was introduced, a new driver's hatch, new track design, a different transmission cover, and a completely new wheel design. Side armor was also increased to 45mm. One of the biggest tank factories was the Stalingrad Tractor Factory, responsible for the production of nearly half the T-34s. This huge factory was also simplifying the tank production process, creating the unique shapes and designs of the various parts required. A massive battle took place in the vicinity of Stalingrad and then in the city itself. New tanks were actually being assembled during the battle and even took part firing from the factory grounds onto the advancing German troops. It was a column of T-34 tanks that had crossed the bridge over the River Don near the town of Kalak between the 21st and 22nd of November 1942 that were effectively encircling the German troops in Stalingrad. In the first half of 1943, the T-34 had received yet another upgrade package. This model had a new hexagonal turret, which gave a bit more space for the 2 crew members inside it. New hatches, which, when open, gave a distinctive shape to the top of the tank. The Germans referred to it as the Mickey Mouse, as these hatches, when open, remind them of the Mickey Mouse cartoon character's ears. New round external fuel tanks were added, an armored hull machine gun mantlet, as well as handrails, which gave the infantry, tank riders, and crew something to hang on to when the tank was in motion. In the summer of 1943, the tank started to receive the commander's cupola on top of the turret, which gave a better all-around visibility to the tank commander. Thus, the T-34s, along with the other mass-produced Soviet tanks, were waiting for the next major offensive. In the summer of 1943, a huge tank battle would take place in the Kursk Bulge, showing the strengths and weaknesses of the tank design. It was here that the last German major offensive in the East would take place, and the critical point of the war. After the battle, the T-34 would roll west towards Germany and Berlin. The T-34 had shown a good balance of armor, firepower, and mobility. Its overall length was 6.68 meters, a width of 3 meters, and a height of 2.45 meters. Its weight was around 26 tons, almost twice as heavy as the BT series. However, unlike the BT series, the T-34 had a 76.2mm cannon, which outclassed the earlier 45mm guns with its penetration capabilities and firepower. Its armor protection was very high for that period during the war. Its frontal armor was 40 to 45mm thick for the hull and 60mm for the turret, and the side armor ranged from 40 to 52mm. Compared to the BT-7, which only had some 6 to 13mm thick armor, this was a huge advantage. It was just the additional depth of armor that made this tank so sturdy and strong. The use of sloped armor had now shown its full potential. For example, a nominal 45mm thickness of the hull frontal armor, angled at 60 degrees, meant that the effective armor that a shell had to penetrate was 90mm. This gave the T-34 a distinct advantage over the German tanks and anti-tank guns, with the greater distances that it could start engaging the enemy from. There were several techniques used in manufacturing the armored sections and joining them all together. Tank armor can be cast, welded, or bolted together. Bolting the sections together was a technique used in the interwar period that had shown its failings during the early stages of World War II. Bolted armor tended to crack and send bolts and shrapnel flying around when hit. The T-34's initial production had used cast armor. The unusual thing was the tank's frontal plate. It was a large metal piece bent into shape using a massive press. This would later be abandoned, and welding and bolting was used instead to simplify the process and make the armor stronger. Later on, a different practice was used. Two plates were joined by a 100mm thick girder, being welded and bolted together. However, there were differences between the factories that they were built in. For instance, tanks from the Stalingrad tractor factory had front glacis plate and rear armor interleaved with the side plates. The gun tube recuperator cover was also simplified, creating a kind of chisel-like shape. There were two main guns used in the production of early T-34 tanks. The first one, the L-11, was a huge leap forward compared to the earlier 45mm guns from the T-26 and BT series. However, it had suffered from malfunctions, lower shell velocity, and a complicated design. A simpler yet more effective design, the F-34 cannon, was used later on. It had better ballistics, it was easier to produce, and remained the main gun until the introduction of the D5 and S-53 85mm guns, used on the T-34 through 85. It could penetrate 92mm of vertical armored plate at a distance of 500 meters, which made it a formidable opponent to any enemy tank that encountered it in 1941. The Soviet Army had conducted tests on earlier captured German tanks, and the general conclusion was that both high-explosive and armor-piercing shells fired from the F-34 could penetrate or damage any German tank at a range of 1,000 meters. The combat load for the T-34-76 was 77 rounds for the main gun and 4,725 rounds for the two DT 7.62mm machine guns. Powering the T-34 was a liquid-cooled aluminum V2 diesel engine developed in the Kharkiv locomotive factory. This engine had 500 horsepower and gave the T-34 a top speed of 53 kilometers an hour. Early production specimens did have deficiencies and problems which were polished in the later stages, but the tank itself had received a rather reliable and good engine. Coupled with the compressed air starting system and lack of return rollers, this proved to be a very good combination, both in the muddy season and later on in the harsh winter conditions. Diesel engines were also less prone to catch fire when the tank was hit, unlike their gasoline counterparts. However, due to the general shortage of V2 engines, some T-34 tanks had to be equipped with Mikulin M17 gasoline engines used on the BT series. The T-34 tank had wide tracks and smaller ground pressure, and weighing in at some 26 tons, it had a good power-to-weight ratio of some 19 horsepower per ton. It had an idler, 5 large diameter road wheels, and a drive sprocket wheel per side, giving it a very distinctive look. When compared to the enemy tanks, the T-34 had a clear advantage in 1941. The German Panzer I and Panzer II tanks were no match for it at all. Having light armor and light weaponry, they stood no chance against the T-34. The Panzer III fared a little better, but its 37mm and 50mm guns were inferior to the T-34's 76.2mm cannon, plus their armor could be penetrated frontally by the T-34 over long distances. The Panzer IV also normally came off worse when confronting the T-34. Its 75mm short cannon was only capable of firing low-velocity, high-explosive shells. The Panzer 35T and Panzer 38T were inferior in every way, especially as they had brittle armor. Mobility was an issue as well. The German tanks were having a difficult time maneuvering through the Russian mud, and later on in the deep snow. Their tracks were narrow, and they were prone to starting difficulties as well as constantly getting stuck. It was clear that the T-34 was a new generation of tank, fully capable of eliminating any type of tank that the enemy could put up against it. However, it did have some shortcomings. Its interior was cramped, especially the turret, and there was no commander's cupola, meaning the commander couldn't achieve good all-around vision and awareness of his surroundings. The fact that the German invasion took place in 1941 meant that numerous problems were arising, such as quality control defects, lack of materials, lack of parts, and problems in organizing mass production. There were numerous innovations and completely new tank parts and systems which were not being thoroughly tested. During these distractions, many defects and problems would appear, and the engineers would face a difficult time of fixing them, optimizing production, and at the same time transferring production to the Urals and the Far East. The birthplace of the T-34, Kharkiv Locomotive Factory, was relocated to the Urals during September and October of 1941 due to the danger of it falling into German hands. Also, a flow of reports was coming in from combat units, complaining about all sorts of deficiencies and problems. Sometimes it was about engine lifespan, sometimes ergonomics, and other times regarding the armor developing cracks. All the reports were taken on board and considered by the engineers and decision-making committees. Coupled with the pre-war ideas of modernizing the tank's base design, this led to the next version and new wave of modifications. From the very beginning of the T-34 production, there had been plans and ideas to modernize the tank. A different gun, engine, better armor, even different suspension were all ideas on the drawing board. The invasion and the start of combat operations had disrupted this and changed priorities. Instead of doing very deep and thorough changes, there were modifications which aimed to simplify production and increase combat value without losing production momentum. That's how the first major improvements and changes were implemented in 1942. In 1942, there was a major shortage of rubber in the USSR. Therefore, all steel road wheels were used for quite some time. It meant more wear and tear on the tracks, noise, and discomfort, but the tanks were being produced and sent to the front. New waffle pattern tracks were designed but were rarely used on the all-steel road wheels. A major improvement and change was designing the new Hexagonal Turret. It was previously planned for the T-34 Tank, one that would never see the production lines but would provide a good testbed for developing new ideas. The new Hexagonal Turret started to appear in mid-1942. It provided a bit more space for the crew, improvements in armor protection, and the whole process itself was simplified compared to the original turret. Turrets were made using two techniques, stamping and casting. The cast version was made using a large 45mm plate, pressed into shape using a 5,000-ton press. The stamped versions had two major techniques, using a large number of individually cast components or using three groups, namely walls, the ring, and roof. These differences were noticeable and depended on the factory that was producing the tank. The turret frontal armor increased from 52 to 70 millimeters. Ammo capacity for the main gun increased to 100 shells. Also in 1942, the driver's hatch was changed as well as the turret hatch. Older variants had used a single turret hatch, which, should it get stuck or broken, would prove fatal in some situations when the tank is hit. The new hexagonal turret would use both this old one and the new separate hatches, depending on the availability and the time when the tank was produced. These distinctive new hatches, when both of them were opened, earned it the nickname Mickey Mouse by the Germans, after the Walt Disney cartoon character's ears. The new changes also affected the fuel storage and capacity. The rectangular external fuel tanks were replaced with new cylindrical ones, subsequently increasing the total fuel capacity by up to 150 liters. Some simpler changes were also introduced, like handrails on the turret and the chassis, allowing easier climbing and holding on to the tank. However, 1942 would prove to be a challenging period. The Wehrmacht would start to receive new weapons that were more effective against the T-34. Panzer III would get a longer 50mm barrel. The Panzer IV was upgunned to a longer 75mm gun on the F2 variant, and a new Pak-40 also started to appear. The Germans were also adopting new tank destroyers like the Stug III Ausf G and the Martyr series. This was in a direct response to the T-34 and KV threat that they were facing, and the battles would stop being so one-sided. With the appearance of a heavy Tiger tank, the Soviet leadership was now fully aware that the T-34 would start losing its edge over its opponents, and something radical needed to be done. The real challenge would be faced during the Battle of Kursk in 1943.